Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join us for some of the most gripping true crime stories out there. Today we're stepping into a case that's been haunting Maryland for nearly half a century. It's the kind of story that grabs you by the heart. A young woman's life cut short, a community left in the dark, and a mystery that seemed like it might never be solved until now. We're talking about the 1975 murder of Roseann Sturtz, a 20-year-old from Baltimore whose death shocked the state and left investigators stumped for decades. But just recently, a jaw-dropping confession has flipped this cold case wide open. So grab a snack, get comfy, and let's unravel this together. Because this isn't just a crime story, it's a human story about loss, perseverance, and the long road to justice. Let's start at the beginning. Who was Roseann Sturtz? Picture this, it's 1975, and Roseann, or Ann as some might have called her, is a 20-year-old living in Baltimore, Maryland. She's young, probably full of that restless energy you feel when you're just starting out in life. Maybe she had a job she liked, or she was figuring out what she wanted to do next. We don't have a ton of personal details about her. News reports tend to focus on the crime, not the person. But we know she was loved. She had a family, friends, people who cared about her deeply. Back then, Baltimore was a bustling city with a mix of charm and grit. Think row houses, Orioles games, and that distinct East Coast vibe. Roseann was part of that world, living her life day by day, probably unaware that everything was about to change. In August of 1975, her story took a tragic turn, one that would leave a mark on her community for decades. It's tough, you know? When someone's life is reduced to headlines, we lose the little things that made them human. What was her favorite song? Did she love the beach? We may never know. But what we do know is that her death wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a fight for answers that lasted almost 50 years. So let's set the scene for what happened. It's a warm summer day in August 1975, and somewhere in Columbia, Maryland, a planned community about 20 miles southwest of Baltimore, a horrifying discovery is made. Roseann Sturtz's body is found. She'd been strangled, and the brutality of it sent chills through the area. Columbia wasn't some big, chaotic city. It was designed to be safe, family-friendly, a place where people could escape the urban grind. So when something like this happened, it hit hard. People were scared, asking, how could this happen here? The Howard County Police Department jumped into action, but they were up against some serious challenges. See, this was 1975. Forensic science wasn't what it is today. No DNA testing, no digital databases to cross-check suspects. Investigators had to rely on shoe leather detective work, knocking on doors, interviewing witnesses, piecing together whatever clues they could find. But in Roseann's case, the leads were thin. Maybe there weren't many witnesses, or maybe the killer was careful. Whatever the reason, the trail went cold fast. Imagine being one of those detectives back then. You've got a young woman's life snuffed out, a family begging for answers, and nothing solid to go on. It's the kind of case that sticks with you, that you think about long after you clock out. For years, decades really, Roseann's case sat unsolved. It became one of those mysteries that people whispered about, a file tucked away in the Howard County PD's cold case unit. But don't think for a second that it was forgotten. Over the years, new detectives would pick up the case, dust it off, and take another look. Maybe they'd find a new angle, a forgotten witness, something to crack it open. And then there was Roseann's family. Can you imagine what they went through? Every anniversary of her death, August rolls around and it's another year without answers. They might have held vigils, talked to reporters, anything to keep her name out there. It's that kind of quiet strength that keeps cold cases alive even when the system stalls. I think about them a lot while researching this. 50 years is a lifetime to wait. Some of the people who knew Roseann back then might still be around, in their 70s or 80s now, still carrying that pain. Others might have passed on, never knowing the truth. It's heavy stuff. Okay, fast forward to 2025, almost 50 years later, and everything changes. Enter Charles William Davis Jr., a 77-year-old man already locked up in prison. He's serving time for other crimes, and during an interview with the police, he drops a bombshell. He confesses to strangling Roseann Sturtz in 1975. Yeah, you heard that right. After all this time, the guy comes clean. And here's the kicker. Davis isn't just some random criminal. He's a serial killer, someone with a history of taking lives. This confession doesn't just solve Roseann's case. It raises all kinds of questions about what else he might have done. Now, let's break this down. Davis sits down with investigators and he starts talking. He gives them details, specific things about the crime scene, how he killed her, stuff that only the murderer would know. And the police? They've got evidence from 1975, preserved all these years, that matches what he's saying. It's like the final piece of a puzzle snapping into place. The Howard County PD didn't waste time. They verified his story, closed the case, and announced that after nearly 5 decades, Roseann Sturtz's killer had been identified. It's a moment of triumph, but also a reminder of how long justice can take. Now, I know some of you true crime buffs out there might be skeptical. A confession is great, but what if he's lying? Maybe he's after attention or trying to mess with the system. Fair point. But this isn't just about his word, it's about the evidence. Back in 75, they didn't have much to work with, but they did preserve what they could. Maybe clothing, fibers, or other traces from the scene. Cold case units are amazing at this stuff. They hang on to evidence for decades, just in case. When Davis confessed, investigators went back to that stash and found things that lined up perfectly with what he described. Think about it. He might have mentioned something super specific, like where her body was positioned or an item left behind. And when they checked the old reports or evidence logs, bam, it's a match. That's why they're so confident calling this case closed. It's not just a hunch, it's science backing up a story. This is why I love cold cases. It's like watching history rewrite itself in real time. Let's zoom out for a sec and talk about the people this affects most. For Roseann's family, this news is huge. After 50 years, they finally know who took her from them. But it's not all relief. There's pain, too. Knowing the truth doesn't erase the loss. It just changes how you carry it. Imagine getting that call from the police. You're in your 70s, maybe 80s, and they tell you, "We found him." It's closure, sure, but it also drags up every memory you've tried to bury. Maybe they're angry that it took so long, or maybe they're just grateful it's over. Either way, it's a complicated mess of emotions. And the community? Columbia's changed a lot since 1975. It's bigger, busier. But for those who were around back then, this hits home. It's a reminder of a time when fear crept into their safe little world. Now, there's a sense of resolution, but also a collective sigh. Finally. So, what's next for Charles William Davis Jr.? He's already in prison, probably for life, given his serial killer status. But does this confession mean more legal trouble for him? Here's the deal. In Maryland, there's no statute of limitations on murder. That means they could charge him for Roseann's death even 50 years later. But here's where it gets tricky. He's 77, already locked up, and likely not going anywhere. Prosecutors might decide it's not worth the time and money to take him to trial when he's already serving a hefty sentence. Still, this confession isn't nothing. It ties him to another crime, adds to his record, and ensures he's remembered for what he did to Roseann. For her family, that might be enough. Justice doesn't always mean a new trial. Sometimes it's just knowing the truth and seeing it acknowledged. One big reason this case got solved? Modern technology. In 1975, forensics were basic. Fingerprints, blood types, maybe some hair analysis if you were lucky. But today, we've got DNA, advanced databases, and tools that can pull answers out of evidence that's been sitting around for decades. The news doesn't say exactly how tech played a role here, but it's a safe bet that it helped corroborate Davis's confession. Maybe they retested something from the crime scene. Or maybe they used new methods to analyze old clues. Whatever it was, it's a perfect example of how science keeps catching up to criminals. This is why cold case units are so vital. Give them the right tools, and they can crack cases that seemed impossible back in the day. It's like giving justice a second chance. Let's shine a light on the unsung heroes here. Over 50 years, dozens of detectives worked on Roseann's case. Picture them. Late nights, coffee-stained files, poring over the same reports, hoping for a breakthrough. Each one passed the torch to the next, refusing to let her story fade. That kind of dedication? It's inspiring. They didn't give up even when the odds were stacked against them. And then there's Roseann's family. Parents, siblings, maybe cousins, who never stopped pushing. They kept her name alive year after year, demanding answers. This win belongs to them as much as anyone. It's their persistence that kept the pressure on, that made sure Roseann wasn't just another statistic. Zooming out, this case says a lot about justice. It's proof that time doesn't erase accountability. 50 years later, and the truth still comes out. It's a shout out to every cop, every family member, every advocate who keeps fighting for cold cases. But it's also a wake-up call. There are thousands of unsolved cases out there. Murders, disappearances, families still waiting. Roseann's story shows what's possible, but it also begs the question, how many more could we solve with better funding, more resources, more attention? It's on us, too. Sharing these stories, keeping them alive, it all matters. Justice isn't just a system, it's a collective effort. Let's talk about Charles William Davis Jr. for a minute. The guy's a serial killer, which means Roseann wasn't his only victim. Serial killers have patterns, ways they operate, types of people they target. So, when he confessed to this, investigators probably perked up and thought, what else has he done? Right now, they're likely digging into other cold cases from the 70s, maybe even beyond Maryland, to see if Davis fits. If he's talking about Roseann, he might spill more. That's the thing with serial killers. Once the dam breaks, you never know what else comes out. For families of other victims, this could be a lifeline. One confession might unlock a dozen mysteries. It's a grim hope, but it's hope nonetheless. To really get this case, we've got to step back into 1975. It was a wild time. Disco was kicking off, Vietnam was winding down, and crime was spiking in a lot of places. Baltimore had its share of troubles, and even quieter spots like Columbia weren't immune. When Roseann was killed, it shook people up because it wasn't supposed to happen there. Columbia was built to be this perfect suburb, a utopia almost. A murder like this? It shattered that illusion, and with no answers, the fear lingered. Could it happen again? Was the killer still out there? Plus, the tools back then were so limited. No DNA, no CCTV, just gut instinct and legwork. It's no wonder the case went cold. It was a different world. Here's something to chew on. Why did Davis confess after all this time? He's 77, been in prison for years. Why now? Is it guilt eating at him? A need to clear his conscience before it's too late? Serial killers are complicated. Some confess for power to relive their crimes. Others want attention, a last grab at infamy. But Davis? Maybe it's simpler. Age, reflection, or even boredom. We don't know his exact motive, but whatever it was, it gave Roseann's family the closure they'd been denied. Or maybe he saw a news story about cold cases and figured the jig was up. Who knows? The mind of a killer is a dark place. Don't sleep on the media here. Over the years, news outlets kept Roseann's story alive. Articles on anniversaries, TV segments, even posts on platforms like X. That constant drip of attention made sure she wasn't forgotten. Maybe that pressure nudged Davis to talk, or maybe it kept the police motivated to revisit the case. Either way, it's a reminder that storytelling matters. It's not just about facts, it's about keeping hope burning. Speaking of today, let's connect this to some current buzz on X. There's talk about Netflix remaking Stephen King's Cujo. A horror tale that's fiction, sure, but Roseann's story proves real life can be just as chilling. Then you've got Eric Stonestreet playing a serial killer in Dexter Resurrection. Funny guy turned dark. It's a twist that echoes how Davis hid his evil. And while sports fans debate Mansfield Town versus Exeter City, it's a reminder that time marches on, but justice can catch up. So, where does this leave us? Roseann Sturtz's case is solved, but it's more than a headline. It's a story of resilience, of a family that never gave up, of detectives who kept pushing, and of a community that finally got answers. It's a call to remember the victims, to support the fight for justice, and to never let these stories fade. Roseann deserved this, and so do all the others still waiting. Thanks for sticking with me through this one, folks. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime goodness. Got thoughts on Roseann's case? Drop them in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.